We have rarely, if ever, seen such a large gathering of world leaders in India as we will see for the G20 Leaders Summit. The meeting presents a formidable logistics challenge, of course, but the greater challenge will be diplomatic, formulating a consensus for the leaders' declaration. The war in Ukraine has polarized the world sharply, and India's tightrope walk between the West and Russia will be tested, as will be its role as the builder of bridges in a range of areas between various countries around the world. India, of course, has its own problems with China, which is something that will be discussed in the course of this discussion. But to discuss the G20 summit and the various issues confronting the grouping, we are very honored to have with us here former Indian diplomat J S Mukul. Ambassador Mukul, thank you for your time. We are delighted and very, very grateful to you. Ambassador Mukul is a G20 veteran of sorts. He has served as sous-sherpa for the G20 process, and he was involved with 6 G20 summits between 2008 and 2011. Ambassador Mukul also served as India's envoy to the Netherlands and Oman and has been posted in cities around the world, from which vantage point he has kept a very close watch on the evolution of India and Indian foreign policy on the world stage. As Dean of the Foreign Service Institute in New Delhi, Ambassador Mukul helped train young Indian Foreign Service officers as well as diplomats from various friendly countries. He is currently Professor Emeritus and Director, International Relations at Sushant University, Gurgaon. Speaking to Ambassador Mukul will be my colleague, Diplomatic Affairs Editor at the Indian Express, Shubhajit Roy. Shubho, you have reported for many years on India's foreign policy, which includes, of course, the various summits of the G20 and a whole range of related issues. All of you can read all of Shubhajit's wonderful reporting, analysis, and commentary on our website, www.indianexpress.com. Today's explained event is brought to you by our partner, Plutus IAS. My thanks to our partner. And to all of you who have logged on, welcome once again. Shubho.
Thank you. Thank you, Manojit, for the generous introduction. And I have to thank Ambassador Mukul for sparing the time out of his very, very busy schedule of teaching students, teaching young minds. And, just to take his introduction a bit forward from where Manojit left, Ambassador Mukul, I think, is one of the most knowledgeable persons on the G20 process outside the current Indian establishment. There's very few people who understand the process because of his depth and breadth of experience he brings to the table. As Manojit rightly pointed out, he was sous-sherpa for 6 G20 summits. And in the formative years when the leader level summit were established after the financial crisis, when global financial crisis of 2008, when the world was in a flux, at that point of time, Ambassador Mukul was the key negotiator from the Indian side. And sous-sherpas are the key negotiators from any government delegation. One interesting point is that Ambassador Mukul has served as ambassador in Oman and Netherlands. And both these countries are guest countries, invitee countries for this year's G20 summit. So, as they say, you can leave G20 process, but G20 never leaves you. So, I think Ambassador Mukul has spent last few months traveling around the country, speaking to students across the country in universities, talking and explaining the G20 process and G20 summits to them. So we are indeed privileged to have him at the Indian Express for this explained live session. And I'm truly, truly thankful to him for sparing the time. Welcome, Ambassador Mukul, to this session. And I would kick off the conversation, by just asking Ambassador Mukul to set the context, essentially to explain to us the evolution of the G20 process, the trajectory from 2008. Obviously, it has been the summit level, But the story actually started much before that. And you are master in sharing that. If you could spend first 10 minutes of the session setting the evolution, the arc of the G20 summit process. Ambassador Mukul, over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Monajit, and thank you, Shobajit, for first of all inviting me, and also for your very kind words and generous introduction. Absolutely delighted to be here this evening. So let us start off, as Shobajit, you mentioned, by trying to understand the G20. And in order to do that, I think it is important that we get a clear idea of how it started and how it evolved. So the evolution of G20, I would divide it into two streams, from the developed countries' perspective and from the developing countries' perspective. Now, let me first look at the developed country perspective. Here, we would need to take a step back, going back to the 1970s, when first the 7 leading industrialized countries or developed economies came together to set up an informal grouping called the G7. Canada, USA, UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. And the reason for doing this was that they wanted to influence global trends, they wanted to tackle cross-cutting issues, and they wanted to address emergent crises. Now, that was the origin of the G7. And at that time, they set the agenda, obviously. But very soon, the G7 realized that that was not good enough. By the time we come to the 1990s, a number of crises were happening, particularly on the financial and economic side. We had for example, in 1994, the Mexican financial crisis. In 1997, the East Asian financial crisis, where the Asian tigers like Singapore, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and ROK were affected. And also in 1999, there was a Russian financial crisis. But most important, of course, was the Asian financial crisis. And in response to that, the G7 realized that they needed the most important of the developing countries or the emerging markets. So they set up a group of 20, but it was at the level of finance ministers and central bank governors only. Now, this was obvious because we were looking at financial or economic crisis. This then continued for a few years, and then we come to the Great Recession, or what is known as the International Financial and Economic Crisis of 2008. Then they realized that this particular grouping at the level of the finance ministers and central bank governors was not adequate, and therefore this was sort of upgraded or raised to the summit level in 2008, where we had the first summit in Washington, D.C. And by the time we come to the third summit, again in Pittsburgh, USA, the grouping had come to be designated as the premier forum for international economic cooperation. That is the evolution from the G7 through the 1999 G20 at the level of finance ministers and central bank governors up to 2008, when it became a summit level or leaders forum. Now, it's also important to look at this evolution from the developing country perspective. Now, we all know that the bread and butter of diplomacy and foreign policy are the bilateral relations. And these obviously are supplemented and complemented by regional and international organizations. Now, the developing countries obviously also had their international organizations, their fora. For example, we had the non-aligned movement more on the political side. We had the G77 mainly on the economic side. The G77 today, I think it has 134 members. So it became very unwieldy. So a G15 was set up, a smaller group of emerging economies and developing countries, and so on and so forth. But typically, these developing country groupings addressed issues on two streams or two verticals. First was South-South cooperation. Now, that is straightforward enough, cooperating among the developing countries as part of their bilateral exchanges and cooperation. The more complicated and challenging was the North, what came to be known as the North-South dialogue. Now, as part of North-South dialogue, it had been the effort of the developing and emerging markets and developing countries, the EMDCs as we call them, to engage the North in a meaningful manner, the developed countries. But unfortunately, that had very limited success. It had mixed results. In fact, I would say that it was a very unsatisfactory situation. And why do I say that? Because very often the communiques sent by the developing countries or the EMDCs, the emerging markets, were not even acknowledged by the developed countries. On some occasions, they would invite a select few of the EMDCs for a side meeting, like a breakfast meeting, for example. In the interim, they also tried to engage at the summit level, the G7, that is, the developed, with a select few. It was the process in this, the interim process was known as the G8 plus 5. And these five were India, China, Brazil, South Africa, and Mexico. This sort of continued for some time. And it is also known as the Heiligendamm L'Aquila process and things like that, taking after cities in Germany and Italy where this process sort of started. But again, it was not good enough. In the meanwhile, the G7 had, of course, between 2014, also incorporated Russia, so that became G8. So now we have a situation when we come to, from the developing country side, when we come to the 2008, we have a situation where we have the G7, G8, and we have a G20, but at the finance ministers level, and we have a G8 plus 5 at the leaders level, but again sporadic. So 2008 is therefore a real landmark when they realized that in order to tackle the Great Recession, they needed all the G20 at the leaders level. And that is when, for the first time in history, the emerging market or developing countries got a place at the high table at the summit level as equals. And the rest, as they say, is history. Now, this is the evolution from the developing countries' perspective. But that evolution does not stop at 2008 or even 2009 when it was anointed as the premier forum for international economic cooperation. If you look at it today, and to cut this span, we fast forward to where we are today, it is not just these 20 countries. Now, let us recall, we have already mentioned the G7, G8. I've also outlined the G5. And the new additions were Argentina, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Republic of Korea, Indonesia, and Australia. So 6 more. So that makes it 19. And plus, of course, the European Union. So that completed, when we come to 2008, the G20. But as I said, today when we meet, when we are going to have the summit, the leaders summit next month in about 10 days time in New Delhi, there will be many more in the room. And therefore, over the years, the G20 has evolved and it has 12 permanent invitees. There's one country, that is Spain, and then there are 11 international organizations who are permanent invitees. These are United Nations, IMF, World Bank, WTO, WHO, ILO, Financial Stability Forum, OECD, ASEAN, and of course, 2 African fora, the African Union and the AU NEPAD. So that makes it 32, 20 plus the 12. Then in addition to that, the host has a prerogative of inviting its guests. Now, in the case of India, we have invited 11 special guests. 3 are organizations: the ISA, International Solar Alliance, and the CDRI, Coalition for Disaster Resistance Infrastructure, both fora in which India has been in the forefront of setting them, and of course, the regional Asian Development Bank. So that now makes it 35. In addition to that, we have 8 invitee countries which are going special invitees at this summit. And as Shubhajit, you already mentioned 2 of them where I had the privilege to serve, Netherlands and Oman. In addition, we have the UAE, Singapore, Bangladesh, and 3 African states, namely Mauritius, Nigeria, and Egypt. Now, therefore, when the summit happens in New Delhi, there will be 43 heads of state or heads of international organizations present there. So that has been the evolution. It is important to note here that the G20 is broadly balanced between developed and developing countries, broadly balanced. But there is a major imbalance when it comes to Africa. The G20 has only one African country, that is South Africa, with the permanent invitees of African Union and AU NEPAD. It makes it 3, but again, it's still a lot of imbalance. So I think Indian presidency has done very well by inviting 3 other African states, Mauritius, Egypt, and Nigeria, so that there is the imbalance is kind of addressed to some extent. But then the evolution doesn't stop here also. So the last point I'll make is that this would have been a good way of addressing the imbalance as far as the Delhi summit is concerned. But what India has done as the presidency, it has written to various countries, all the members of G20, that we would like to have the African Union as a additional member, a full member of the G20. Now, I think this is to redress this imbalance on a more sustainable and lasting basis. Also, I think it is a low-hanging fruit in terms of achievement. After 24 years since 1999 of the G20's establishment, it will be the first time that an expansion will take place. I think it's a great plus for the Indian presidency, for the Delhi summit. And also, if I may say, I think it fits in well, very well, and sits well with our G20 theme of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, one future. And also, it resonates exceedingly well with our focus on the global south. So that, Shubhajit, is the complete evolution as I understand it, right from the G7, the G8, then the G20, first at the level of finance ministers and central bank governors, then at the summit level, and also the evolution coming from the developing country side, where there was a challenge to address north-south issues. Then came the Heligan Dam Lakila process of G8 plus 5, and finally, so to say, it took the crisis of 2008 for us to get a place at the high table, at the summit level as equals. And so that is the evolution. This is continuing. And as we see, maybe if given the emerging consensus on African Union, the Delhi summit will also add to the evolution of the G20.
That's fascinating, Ambassador Mukul. The way you compressed the history and the arc of the evolution of the G20's process as we know today. This background will really be helpful to all the audience, including a lot of students as well as a lot of diplomats who might be logged in right now to this particular session. One point I would like to mention that if you want to ask a question, please write it in the chat box, and we would pick some of them to be answered by Ambassador Mukul. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat box. Ambassador Mukul, the next thing I wanted to understand from you, you explained how there are now 43 countries or international organizations whose heads will be gathering in New Delhi. Now, before a G20 summit takes place, there's a process, and that process is very extensive at various levels. There are processes at the official level, at the ministerial level, at the Sherpa level, also at different countries also have separate tracks, civil society or involved business. So there's a which feeds into the final G20 summit and the communique. If you could explain the process, there is a finance track, there's a Sherpa track, all these tracks, if you could, because you were the sous-sherpa and you negotiated documents, 6 documents. I'm sure we'll come to that, how you negotiated them as well. But if you could give us a sense of the process that is involved in the lead up to any G20 summit.
Yeah. So now, first of all, we should understand that G20 is an informal grouping. And what do I mean by that? I mean basically two things. One is on the secretariat side, it has no secretariat. The fear was that the organization may be captured by international bureaucrats. So really, it is the presidency which provides the secretariat with the help of the troika, the immediate outgoing, the present, and the incoming. For example, therefore, in our case, the troika comprises Indonesia, which is the last presidency, India, and Brazil, which is the incoming presidency. It is also informal because the decisions, while the decisions of the G20 are absolutely important, they do not get implemented automatically. We need to understand this, that why first are the decisions important? The decisions obviously are important because of the weight and heft of the grouping itself. The G20 today represents 50% of the landmass of the world. It represents 2/3 or 67% of the global population. It represents 3/4 or 75% of the international trade, and it represents 85% of the global GDP. So the decisions are important. What happens in terms of these decisions is they send, and it is informal. So the summit leaders through the communique send important political impulses to on various issues. To take a concrete example to understand it, suppose the summit pronounces on trade issues. The decision has to be formalized in the WTO. If there is a impulse or a consensus decision coming on financial issues, the actual decision will have to be taken in the IMF or the World Bank. Similarly, if the decision relates to any other area, climate, then it will go to the COP and the UNFCCC. So that is the background to this. Now, the way it is structured, the working methods of the what you alluded to, the various tracks, the G20 works in three major tracks. One is two official tracks. One is first the financial track. Obvious reasons, it started as a finance minister central bank governors grouping. So there is the finance track. There, in the after 1999, this was obviously the most important track because there was no Sherpa track, and therefore today it has 8 working groups. Then after 2008, when it became elevated or upgraded to the summit level, we have the Sherpa track. And Sherpa, for those who don't know, is a metaphor from the mountaineering domain, where the Sherpa is supposed to do the heavy lifting or assist the mountaineer. So basically, since this is a leaders forum, the Sherpa track came up, and therein today we have 13 working groups. And India's contribution of India's presidency has been the working group on disaster risk resilience and reduction. So this is a concrete, the 13th working group that has been set up is an Indian contribution. The third is then the unofficial track, the track 2, what you referred to as the civil society, etc., wherein we have 11 they call them the engagement groups, 11 engagement groups, And there, of course, again, the Indian contribution has been the Startup 20, or we call the S20. There are various, the Women 20, the Youth 20, now the S20, and so on and so forth. So these are the three major tracks from which inputs are coming. In addition, I think the Indian presidency has held more than 15 ministerial meetings. Officially, the ministers do not have a say. That is why you have the Sherpa assisting the heads of government, heads of state and government. The ministers, they come to a decision, their communiques have been put out, and they constitute an input for the Sherpas meeting. Now, I don't know whether it's so well known, because the Sherpas don't put out anything when they have a meeting as a communique. They are working for the final communique at the summit. We have had three Sherpas meeting. It started off last year in Udaipur, then they had one in Kumarakom in Kerala, and the last one in Hampi. And obviously, there will be now a final Sherpas meeting back to back before the summit happens, wherein they will be finally crafting the communique. So this is the process by which all the inputs, and in these three meetings, various Sherpas of various countries would have made general statements. They would have brought forward proposals, and those are, of course, discussed threadbare. Also, proposals coming from the ministerial meetings and the finance track, etc., which actually then combine at the level of the Sherpa. So that is the process. One more point on this: G20 decisions are taken by consensus. So let us also be very clear that whatever anybody does, each sovereign member has a kind of veto on every decision. So that is broadly the process by which this goes forward.
Right. So you explained Sherpa is being the US sous-sherpa. How did this term sous-sherpa come about?
Well, sous is only a French term. I mean, these are from diplomacy. The French always have been in the forefront. So sous only means a deputy. So really, I was a deputy to the Sherpa, and therefore sous-sherpa. I think that's fairly straightforward.
Okay. Yeah. So, sir, as sous-sherpa, you negotiated the joint statement or the communique of G20 summits. If you could, for our listeners, explain to us, how does a communique arrive at? What is the process? How does it start? Then, there are sort of differences, divergences on phrases, on formulation, and countries, they then negotiate. How, if you could take us through, what is the process to come up to a joint communique?
Well, basically, I think, Shubhajit, every country brings something to the table, what is of interest to them. And obviously, India as a presidency has its own priorities, and we could come to the agenda and priorities if that is of interest later. But the all these are put together in first draft. There are any number of drafts and revs coming out in terms of, and each word, each sentence, each para is negotiated threadbare. Obviously, this is done by the Sherpas, and then you break up into smaller groups, and where the Sherpas also kind of because sometimes they are happening in parallel, etc. So that is where the finance track is also negotiating its own issues and paragraphs, and ultimately they all come to the Sherpa for a final. So what will happen in this forthcoming Sherpa meeting, as I see, there will already be a document which is being negotiated. Much of it would have been, in fact, a very major part of it would have already been agreed by consensus. There would obviously be some issues pending, which would be ironed out, hopefully, in the forthcoming Sherpas meeting, and then it's put up to the leaders for their approval. The negotiations are done at the Sherpa level, and obviously then the leaders summit approves it before it is issued.
Right. So now we come to the India's presidency, because India is hosting this summit, and there has been criticism of India hosting this summit, and it's being projected in a very big way. Some there have been criticism that it's been sort of used for political advantage as well. But there has been an argument that it is a rotational presidency. Now, if you could tell us, how is this rotational presidency arrived at? Is it alphabetical or is it not? What is the order in which presidencies rotate amongst countries?
Well, when it was set up, it was a fairly ad hoc arrangement in 2008 when it came to the Washington summit, when this whole process started. And since the crisis was so acute and so serious across the world, we had two summits in 2009 and 2010. So, after the summit in Washington, D.C., in the second half of 2008, we had two summits, London and Pittsburgh in 2009, and thereafter Toronto and Seoul in 2010. By the time the Great Recession or the international financial and economic crisis had by and large been contained or overcome, and then a decision was taken that perhaps there's no need for two summits, we will do it on an annual basis. So that is the basis. And ever since 2011, the presidency has been rotating on an annual basis, and there has been one summit. And they have also now fixed the date. It is the presidency, irrespective of when the summit is held, the presidency is from the 1st of December to the 30th of November next year. So, like India started its presidency on 1st of December 2022, and we will hand it over. We will complete our presidency on 30th of November, even though the summit is being held in September for many reasons, I guess. Now, your other point about the how is it decided? Most people believe that it is an alphabetical rotation. But let me clarify that this is not so. And I think it'll be very obvious that if it was alphabetical, it will not go after India to Brazil and after Brazil to South Africa. There is a very unique, what we call the bucket system in the G20. There are, in fact, 5 buckets, if I can mention that. And in each of the buckets, there are 4 countries, except for one bucket, which has 3, because European Union does not host a summit or does not hold the presidency. So there are 19 sovereign countries. They have this bucket system in which it rotates. Now, most of the buckets are regional. For example, the Latin American bucket has Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. Some other, the bucket number 5 is Republic of Korea, Japan, China, Indonesia, and so on. There are some buckets which are mixed buckets. Like India is in a bucket which is Russia, India, Turkey, and South Africa. Similarly, there is the bucket number 1 has USA, Canada, Australia, and then for Saudi Arabia. So I mean, it's really not clear how this was brought about, but the objective is clear why it was made so. The objective was that the rotation is such that it alternates between developed and developing countries. Now, you will immediately ask me, how is it that 4 developing countries are hosting the summit now? Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. The answer to that, Shubhajit, is that initially the summits were front loaded in favor of the developed countries. The first 6 summits were in developed countries after 2008 in order to tackle the serious crisis. So it was USA, UK, again USA, Canada, Korea, France. In fact, it's only the 7th summit that it came to Mexico, one of the EMDCs. So that is the reason. But once we complete this cycle in 2025 with South Africa, I presume we will go back to the bucket system of rotation, where of course it will be an annual rotation, but also the summits will alternate between a developed country and a developing country.
This bucket system reminds me of the group stages, group matches in FIFA World Cup. Sort of a mix of countries with no correlation to otherwise.
Yeah. Now, that don't ask me why it was. We should pose the question to the G7, I presume, who were actually at the time setting this up. So, but I think that the objective is a very valid one. That it's good that the summit alternates rather between a developed and a developing country. Though in this cycle it has not strictly happened, but I think this is an aberration or an exception. I think next cycle, 2026 onwards, we'll go back to that.
So let me come to the Indian presidency, and you've watched it from outside, obviously. But let us talk about the Indian priorities. That has been outlined by the government last year when it was accepting the presidency in Bali. And then, if you could give us a sense of sort of the direction or the deliverables that one could expect from emanating from those priorities. If you could enlighten us on that.
First thing, Shubhajit, I think there are already some major achievements of the Indian presidency. And I'll point out, and these are in the domestic, within the country, and I'll point out two of them to you. One is, I think it is very unique that we have used our presidency to showcase India, showcase the incredible India, mother of democracy in all its glory, diversity, variety, etc., to the world at large. By the time we finish our presidency, the G20 meetings would have been held in 200 plus meetings would have been held in over 50 locations or cities. And there we are showcasing our culture, our traditions, our customs, even the couture and the cuisine and all the rest of it. So I think there will be a major benefit, collateral benefit in terms of a boost to tourism. Now, I have already read reports that after the tourism working group met in Jammu and Kashmir, the foreign tourist arrivals there have gone up substantially. So that, I think, is a major achievement already of our presidency, a priority that was. A linked thing to that is taking the G20 to all corners of the country, to all sections of our society. I have myself, as you also mentioned in your introduction, been involved in this outreach of what is called the G20 University Connect Engaging Young Minds program. There is also the Youth G20 Youth program, and so on and so forth, various engagement groups. There again, I think they have done extremely well, because I think a very large population within India is today sensitized. So this is what has already happened. Now, before I come to the specific Indian priorities, let me also mention to you that the G20 has come to acquire a kind of a Christmas tree approach. What do I mean by this? It really means that all the issues that have been taken up in the previous summits, 17 of them, have come to acquire a life and momentum of their own. So they are all there going forward. It's not that we work in silos, that one presidency ends and those issues and now the Indian priorities come up. So those issues will obviously be there. In addition to that, there will be the Indian priorities, which I will now outline for you. First, as the Honorable Prime Minister explained, the priority of India's G20 will be inclusive, ambitious, action-oriented, and decisive. So that is the broad framework in which the leadership has approached the Indian priorities. Now, I think we did also something very well in terms of taking on board the opinions of the other developing countries which are not members of the G20. And that, I think, is important, because just because India and some of the other leading EMDCs have now got a place at the high table does not mean that we should forget our other partners in the developing world, in the G77, etc. So the Prime Minister convened the summit of the Global South, wherein the issues of the South were taken on board. So our first priority, therefore, and this is a cross-cutting priority, is the Global South issues, the entire development agenda, as we call it. So that, I think, will permeate almost every aspect of India's presidency. Now, coming to the more specifics, I could outline for you very briefly a half a dozen quick points on the Indian priorities. The first one is green development, climate finance, climate change, lifestyle for environment, etc. Basically, we know we have a climate crisis on our hand. We have the developing countries are the ones which are suffering the most. They need support both for adaptation and mitigation measures from the developed countries in terms of technology, in terms of finance. And I hope that the G20 communique will strongly put forth this point that the developed countries should provide the $100 billion per year, which they were supposed to do from 2020, but have not really met their commitment right through to 2025. So climate change is going to be an important priority. Linked to that is this lifestyle for environment, or what we call life at for a sustainable environment at the individual, national, and global level for a cleaner, greener, and bluer future for all of us. And again, linked to that is the network of individuals involved with this, the pro planet people, or the P3. So the first major specific Indian priority is climate justice, climate finance, climate justice, the whole area of climate change and sustainability. The second one would be technological transformation or digital public infrastructure. Now, we all know the progress that India has achieved, or the successes that we have achieved in the field of IT, in the field of digital, etc. I don't have to go into that, just to point out that our CoWIN app, for example, was a great success, having delivered in a 2 billion shots of vaccines during the pandemic in an orderly manner. Then we have the UPI platforms. In fact, a recent CNN report even said that India's consumption of data today is more than that of United States and China combined. So the short point here is that we have these achievements and we are making it available to the global south, of course, but to anybody who is interested in the whole area of digital public infrastructure or technology transformation. The third one, which I will mention, is the accelerated, inclusive, and resilient growth as a cornerstone of sustainable development. Now, this obviously impinges on the 17 sustainable development goals that the global south wants to take. And here again, I'm looking forward to the communique telling the developed countries, because frankly, we don't need the developed countries to tell us as in global south, that what we have to do for development. It is they should put their money where their mouth is. And they have commitments since the 1970s, wherein they are supposed to contribute 0.7% of their GDP or GNI as part of the official development assistance. And of course, to be complemented by the reforms of the multilateral development banks in terms of raising their capabilities for financing, etc. So that, I think, is a major. These commitments should be forthcoming, and that is because they are really required by all the developing countries, the global south. The fourth priority of India is food security and energy security. Now, we have gone through many crises: food crisis, fertilizer crisis, energy crisis. We already referred to the climate crisis. And the interesting thing is that the main sufferers are the developing countries, the global south, and nobody seems to be listening. So G20 in that sense is well positioned to address these crises that are affecting particularly the global south. And therein, this issue of unilateral sanctions of which is aggravated the food crisis and the energy crisis, I hope will also be addressed. The fifth Indian priority is women equality or women empowerment or gender equality. Now, therein, obviously, it's also an SDG, part of SDG 5. India has had various schemes, has brought forward various schemes for the uplift of women. But I think here the short point again is that the G20 needs to mainstream gender equality and women empowerment in all its areas. I'm very happy to note that the G20 Development Working Group report, which was endorsed by the G20 Development Ministers meeting in Varanasi in June this year, has very far-reaching recommendations in this regard. And last but certainly not the least, is the priority of reform of the multilateral institutions. Now, India has always been a supporter of multilateralism, but we see that these were crafted in the post-World War II era, and many of them do not today reflect the ground realities to be relevant. To give you concrete examples, the United Nations is been proving ineffective in various areas, including Ukraine, which you mentioned. The WTO was kind of dysfunctional during the pandemic. The WHO came up short, and of course, the Bretton Woods institutions, both the IMF and the World Bank, we have been looking to reform them ever since the Pittsburgh Summit. So basically, today, reformed multilateralism is the need of the hour. It is the demand of the global south and a priority of India's G20 presidency. So those are the specific priorities. But let me conclude this in a final point by mentioning that these priorities fixed at the beginning of our presidency, but the global situation, the international situation is dynamic, and they don't stay there. There are other issues which have arisen which also would need to be addressed. Just to take one issue, there is today banking. We have seen in the past 2 quarters banking or financial turbulence again on both sides of the Atlantic. 3 US banks have failed in the last quarter. One bank shut shop in this quarter. And if we should remember that the G20 earned its spurs during the 1999 the financial crisis, Asian financial crisis, and then more importantly during the Great Recession of the 2008. So I think the G20 needs to address these budding problems and nip them in the bud, so to say, before they become a full-blown global financial or economic crisis. So those, for me, are the priorities of the Indian presidency, which have been put forward, and I'm sure the communique, we will see them addressed in a very meaningful manner. A very substantive communique, in my reckoning, awaits us at the summit.
So we'll come to the communique and the also the geopolitical sort of situation, how it is sort of playing out. But before that, I would want to know from you. India has been part of G20 at the leaders level since 2008. If we look at if we try to divide the summit tree in two parts. One is under the UPA government from 2008 to 14, and then under the present government since 2014 onwards. So, if you could tell us, do you see any similarities, any continuities and differences between the two sort of these phases, if I may introduce that word and concept? And how do you see that playing out?
See, Shubhajit, in 2008, the G20 was a very much focused thing. There was this crisis to be addressed. There was no Sherpa's track, for example. There was the word used was the heart and soul of G20 was really the framework working group on strong, sustainable, inclusive, and balanced growth. The whole, for the first 2 or 3 years, up to 2011, if I can say, were focused on addressing the global, international, and financial crisis. So that was the time when the finance track was very important. India, of course, had issues. We had on climate, we had a defensive agenda at that time. We were very strong even then on development assistance and on multilateral reform of the multilateral organizations. So that was in 2011, after the crisis abated, the agenda of the G20 started broadening. Development came to the fore after the Seoul summit and so on and so forth. Other issues came into
10 onwards.
10 onwards, 10, yeah, Seoul was towards the second half of 2010 onwards. Other issues started coming. There is therefore a continuity. I already mentioned all the issues which were there. There is continuity, but with change. Now, the change that has happened in the last few years is that after 2015, for example, on climate, we have a very positive agenda. We are no longer a defensive agenda on that. In terms of the other issues, yes, as I pointed out, we would very much like to see the developed countries meet their commitments on development issues. We would very much like to see multilateral issues. Now, again, on multilateral reform of the multilateral organizations, there is continuity with change. At that time, we were talking only because of the financial issues, only of the World Bank and IMF reforms, the quota and the voting reforms. Today, we are talking, again, we are still talking of reforms of the multilateral organization, but a broader gamut. You have got now we have also got the WTO and the WHO after the pandemic. So that, I think, is the change. I mean, as I said, the whole thing is a process. So in that sense, the process continues. And obviously, every government, every country brings its priorities to the fore. Also, you must remember that in the first, as you divided it, there was no Indian presidency. So in that sense, there were no Indian priorities spelled out. We were part of the process. And obviously, we would bring our concerns and our priorities to the fore at that time. Now we have the presidency. It happens once in 20 years. So we have put forward a very, very, as I said, a very positive and a very ambitious and inclusive, taking on board the concerns of the global south, etc., an inclusive agenda. So that is where it is. It is continuity with change.
Yeah, I still remember during that time, in the early days of summits after 2008 onwards, how Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was sort of almost mobbed by other world leaders at the Leaders' Lounge on economic sort of issues. And I still remember U.S. President Obama once referred to him as the guru who would be talking about the economic challenges and how to overcome those shocks from the Great Recession, from the global economic crisis. So at that point in time, also, although India didn't hold the presidency, but it was contributing in a meaningful manner.
Very much so. Absolutely, very much so. We were in the forefront, and I think we were one of those very proactive delegations or countries looking at that.
Yeah, yeah. Coming to the current sort of situation of the geopolitics, before I move to the audience questions, I wanted to just get your sense on, this Russia-Ukraine war has cast a shadow on the G20 summit process. Last year in Bali, we saw there was sort of last minute sort of consensus that was arrived at on para 3 and para 4, those two paras on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. This year, again, it has, again, the issue is very much top of the mind. And so far, we have seen through the ministerial meetings, whether the foreign ministers meeting or the finance ministers meeting or any of even the working group meetings at the other sectoral ministerial meetings, the joint statements have been chair summary and outcome document and not a joint communique because of those two paras where Russia and China are obviously opposing the framing that the G7 countries would want. In this kind of a situation, how do you see India negotiating and coming out with a consensus paragraph, a consensus document in the G20 communique in the coming days?
Shubhaji, let me answer this by saying first that recall that G20 is the premier forum for international economic cooperation. So frankly, while geopolitics is a major challenge, and in that you have alluded to the specific challenge posed by the Ukraine paragraphs, But basically, if you ask me, these paras don't belong in the communique. This is a premier forum for international economic cooperation. It addresses economic, financial, trade, etc. issues, and therefore, to bring in geopolitics is a major. Obviously, it's a major challenge for the Indian presidency. One understands that, but really they don't belong there. Now, what happens here is India first, thanks to the standing and stature of our Prime Minister, the capabilities and the credibility of India, given its policy of strategic autonomy, coming from the non-aligned to the multi-aligned to the all-aligned, etc. We have that credibility, and therefore I think we are well positioned to build bridges, to act as a catalyst, to try and get everybody on board, to forge a consensus. But let me also recall to you that G20 works on the basis of absolute consensus. And I mentioned while we were discussing the process that every country has a veto. So as a presidency, we can do all that we want to facilitate. But let us be very clear. G20 belongs to all the 20 members as equal stakeholders. They all have to own up the process and take responsibility. Now, whether this happen, I personally remain cautiously optimistic that we will get a communique at the summit, but really the onus is on every member. It is certainly not because of India. India will try as the presidency all there is, all it has, all possibilities to forge this consensus. And as I said, we are well positioned to do this for the reasons that I mentioned. But really, it is for every country to to take ownership, take believe that they own the process and are equal stakeholders in this, because the geopolitics issues, it can become an open-ended challenge. They can distract, they can detract, they can divert or even derail the process. There's no end to that. So that is where I think we come from. And I can only quote to you what the honorable external affairs minister has said. He mentioned, let G20 be G20. It should refocus there. It should stay there. Basically, what he's trying to say is that it should focus on, as it is his official position, the premier forum for international economic cooperation, and not try to solve every problem under the sun.
Right. So with that, I would move to questions from our audience, and flooded with messages and chat box, as well as personally, people are messaging me, and there are people who are lined up to ask questions. The first question comes from Insha Naz. If you could unmute yourself and then ask the question, Insha Naz.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, sir, for the fascinating and mind-storming session. This is Insha, a career psychologist at Plutus IS.
Yes, please.
I would like to ask about the G20, which is a club of the world's leading economies. Its economic weight and broad membership are claimed to give the group a high degree of legitimacy and influence over the management of the global economy and financial system. Meanwhile, the world is a highly polarized between the US, UK, EU on one hand and the China, Russia on the other hand. In this context, how would India respond to the global problem when geopolitics have clouded world politics?
I think
Thank
she
you,
has
sir.
a similar
Thank you.
question on the geopolitics. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Insha. Very good question. No, basically, as I think I was already answering some part of this, really, it is not India's problem. India has the presidency and India is doing everything. But as I said, every member has an equal stake. And ultimately, multilateral organizations, it is a beast where nobody gets everything. Compromises have to be made to reach a consensus. And G20 is no different. So therefore, in order to get a consensus, if there is political will on the part of the 20 members, I am confident, as I said, I'm cautiously optimistic that at the Delhi summit, we will get a communique, particularly given the effort that India is making and the credibility, etc., that we have. But really, it is for each member to introspect and see whether they would like to derail the process by this. In any case, even if you take the hypothetical situation of a communique not being there, the outcome documents are all agreed documents. It is only, as Shubhajit pointed out, para 3 and 4 that were hanging fire. So rest of the thing which is really the domain of the G20, which is really the focus, should be the focus of the G20, those will go forward, and this will remain in terms of agree to disagree kind of situation. But as I said, at this point, I remain cautiously optimistic that we'll get a communique. But really, it is not to be seen that it is only it is an Indian problem. Yes, we have the presidency and we are doing all that we can and we'll continue to do. And this will go down to the wire. Experience of the summit shows that communiques are sorted out at midnight or the night. In this case, maybe if you take the analogy, midnight of 9th or 10th or early hours of the morning of the 10th of September. So that will happen. This some brinkmanship will obviously be there, but we hope that ultimately we'll get a communique. Even otherwise, as I said, we are assured of a very rich menu of achievements going by what has come out already in the ministerial meetings and the inputs that would be going into the final document.
So as we understand, your successors will have some sleepless nights leading up to the summit.
Yeah, they have to earn their bid.
Yes, absolutely. The next question is from Kunal Bhardwaj. If you could unmute yourself, Kunal, and ask a question.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Yeah, good evening. Please go ahead.
Sir, Kunal Bhardwaj this side. I want to ask that how does India's presidency of the G20 will have impact on countries' economic and diplomatic priorities? You have highlighted many of them and mentioned like technology, sustainable development, and food energy security. But will it have an impact on diplomatic priorities, as it's a time India have to choose between US and Russia? Will have this impact on this as well, and what could be the potential strategies that could be employed to ensure a successful and impactful summit? As you mentioned that India has invited three African nations to make a balance, which is in the G20 countries. So what can be that? Thank you, sir.
No, I think let's not mix up. The African thing is to redress a particular imbalance which was there, and that is separate. Now, on this question of USA versus Russia or the West versus whoever else, let us be very clear. India has always stood for strategic autonomy, and we are not going to, I think, ally now or in the foreseeable future with one group or the other. We will obviously, the credibility which I mentioned of India's presidency comes from the fact that we are trying to be the honest brokers in terms of drafting the communique. Now, as I said, the Ukraine problem is not going to be settled in the summit here. That's not going to happen. So really, it is to see whether that language needs to be there, whether you can have a communique without the language, because as I said, in my view, it does not fit in there, or you can have a diluted statement, because I don't think any country in a consensus document can accept criticism of itself. That's not the purpose, and that should not be, because after all, the G20 is a cooperation forum. We are trying to cooperate on the issues that we can agree and not bring in problem areas or disputes there. So that is where it is. As I said, no country gets everything. Compromises have to be made, and therefore, in a manner of speaking, the lowest common denominator will prevail. You may have to reduce I mean, you have to moderate the language in terms of getting a consensus.
Right. So the next question is from Mr. J Shah.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm a huge fan of you, Shivajit, because I've been following you as an International Express editor, the section editor for a long time, and thank you for being able to talk. So, sir, my first question was like, since the question I intended to ask was already covered by the previous questioners, the question I wanted to ask is first, uh, Chinese President Xi Jinping has told at the last moment that he won't be available to attend the summit. While he attended the BRICS summit in person, he's deputing the Chinese premier instead of him to come to the summit. And secondly, just before a few days, China has released a standardized map saying that it considers Aksai China and Arunachal as a part of its territorial domain. So how could it prove to be a dampener, or should we read something into the timings of and the negation from the Chinese side, or is it just the usual part of this Mandarin diplomacy where you can't just get to know what the other side intends to send the signals?
Thank you, Mr. Shah. Just to set the record straight, so far there has been no official announcement, confirmation, or of the fact that Chinese President Xi Jinping is not coming. So I think that question is still open, although there are indications that there's an uncertainty over his attendance, but so far there's been no confirmation either ways. So, Ambassador Mukul, I would let you answer to the.
No, as you have already clarified, it's a hypothetical question. But let me also point out here that a large number of leaders have not attended summits in the past. But that in a multilateral context, it does not make any difference. The Chinese delegation will be there as a sovereign country. At what level it is, it's a different level. I mean, there's different questions, but really China will be present at the G20 summit. Whatever level it is, that I think it's not useful to speculate. Today there were also reports that the Mexicans are sending their economic minister, and the Omani will be at the level of deputy PM. I don't know the authenticity or veracity of these, but these are reports already in the media. So, but that really does not detract from the G20. After all, when we talked of 43 heads of state and government and leaders of international organizations, obviously some of them will be represented by their deputies or representatives. But I must point out here that it is to the credit of the Indian leadership that Indian Prime Minister has been present at all 17 G20 summits that have happened right since 2008 to date. So that I think is important to note. But really, I mean, who comes, who doesn't, in terms of the G20 process, it makes no difference. It may make a difference in terms of the media perception, in terms of maybe the bilaterals that happen. Incidentally, a lot of bilaterals also happen on the sidelines. So it may make a difference in those terms, but really it does not make a difference in terms of the G20 process itself.
Right. Before I move to the next audience question, there's a question from in the chat box. It's an interesting one. That as India is hosting G20 presidency with the motto of Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, how is it going to help in bridging the gap between the global north and global south?
Well, the whole idea of this one Earth, one family, one future is that India is trying to bring on board. As I mentioned, also we have the effort is to bridge the gap. And when you talk of consensus, it's also trying to bridge the gap. So basically, we are trying to forge consensus on most important global issues that are there on the table. And by forging consensus means that you're trying to bridge the gap between the various sides in order to come to a meaningful conclusion. So that is where it is.
Right. Thank you. The next question is from Tushar Racing. Tushar?
Hello, sir.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Good evening, sir. मैं डॉक्टर तुषार राइसिंग, डिपार्टमेंट ऑफ डिफेंस एंड स्ट्रेटेजिक स्टडीज, नॉर्थ पार्सी यूनिवर्सिटी से बात कर रहा हूँ. सर, हिंदी में बात कर सकता हूँ?
जरूर.
थैंक यू सर. सर, मेरा मुकुल सर से एक प्रश्न है. सर, अभी G20 का जो अपना सितंबर में हमारे कंट्री में जो एक बड़ा कॉन्फ्रेंस होने वाला है, तो प्रश्न ये है सर मेरा कि ये जो अभी ग्लोबल साउथ और ग्लोबल नॉर्थ का बात चल रहा है कि ऑलरेडी अभी यूरोप 2 पार्ट में डिवाइड हो चुका है रशिया यूक्रेन वॉर के बाद में, और G20 का जो डायस है सर, उस डायस में चाइना और रशिया ये बहुत बड़े प्लेयर है. तो इस मीटिंग में उनका पार्शली आना या एम्बेसडर उनके फॉरेन मिनिस्टर को यहाँ भेजना, तो आपको ऐसा लगता है कि ये जो G20 का जो प्लेटफॉर्म है वो अपने निर्धारित लक्ष्य को इस टेंशन में, इस एटमॉस्फेयर में अचीव कर पाएगा? और दूसरा प्रश्न मेरा ये है सर कि इसमें इंडिया इन दोनों यूरोप के जो पोलराइज ग्रुप है उनको इंडिया कैसे उनके साथ डील कर सकता है, या अपना आगे का क्या स्टैंड होना चाहिए? क्या हम इन टेंशंस को मिटाने में एक बहुत बड़ा लीडिंग रोल आगे आने वाले दिनों में प्ले कर सकते हैं या नहीं? थैंक यू सर.
नहीं, धन्यवाद, थैंक यू. आपने सवाल पूछा. पहला सवाल तो ये है कि जो आपने कहा कि मैंने वो ऑलरेडी आंसर कर दिया है पार्शली, कि कोई आए या ना आए वो डेलीगेशन कंट्री प्रेजेंट रहेगी. वो कम्युनिके में उसका प्रोसेस पे इतना कोई असर नहीं पड़ता है, क्योंकि वो कंट्री का जो भी प्रतिनिधि होगा, डेलीगेशन का जो भी उसका नेतृत्व करेगा, वो उसमें अपने कंट्री का करेगा की बात रखेगा और उसके बेसिस पे कंसेंसस बनेगी. दूसरा जो आपने पूछा वो एक बायलैटरल इशू है, वो कि इंडिया क्या कर रहा है इन टर्म्स ऑफ मीडिएशन वगैरह. उसमें G20 का ये सवाल नहीं है. ये वैसे हम तो आते, लेकिन हमें पता है कि हमने अपने गुड ऑफिसेस ऑफर किए हुए हैं. अगर हमारी सहायता मांगी जाएगी तो हम इसके लिए तैयार हैं.
थैंक यू. नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन इज फ्रॉम यामिनी बाना. Yamini, if you could unmute yourself and ask the question. Yamini, you can go ahead, please, and ask the question.
Thank you. Good evening to all. Thank you, Indian Express, for hosting these highly informative sessions, and to the esteemed guests too. Thank you for providing such information, such insights into the topic in such bite and bit-sized manner. It was really great listening to the session. My question is that how can India during its presidency take a lead in taking all the G20 countries from seemingly high, far-reaching principles in terms of climate change that we all have in sight to actual collective action that is required to mitigate the ravages of climate change right now.
No, Yamini, I can assure you that, as I mentioned, when the final document comes out, the outcome document, the communique, you will have a very substantial formulation on this, which is an Indian priority: the climate change, the climate finance, the climate justice, the lifestyle for environment, the pro-planet people, etc. So you will have a very substantial formulation on this. I mean, that is what one expects on the basis of what has been put out so far by the ministerial, etc., declarations on this issue. So, well, I don't want to obviously try and prejudge the communique, but I think we can be assured of a very rich menu of substantive achievements coming out of the Delhi summit, including on the subject of climate change that you mentioned.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Mukul. This is really a very, very informative, insightful session, and I can see that you've taught generation of young diplomats at the Foreign Service Institute in India, and also diplomats from overseas. And some of our audience are preparing for the civil services examination to get into the Indian Foreign Service would be some of their aims, objectives, and you've learned from the best that this country can offer, because Ambassador Mukul has had the experience of teaching international relations, foreign policy to the young professionals, the young Indian Foreign Service officers. So I have to really thank Ambassador Mukul for sparing an hour, 15 minutes of your time, and really educate us on the history, the current status, and the challenges that the Indian presidency faces. And before I wrap up, I want to ask Ambassador Mukul that what is your sense? Do you think a joint communique with consensus is possible in this current polarized atmosphere, where Putin is not has said that the Russian president, he will not attend the summit and instead send Foreign Minister Lavrov. But do you think a joint communique is in sight?
Well, Shubhajit, it's a difficult question, but as I said, I remain cautiously optimistic that we will have a joint communique. But really, as I said, whatever is the outcome document, we are assured of a very rich outcome from the Delhi summit. I think we will leave it at that. But absolutely delighted to be here, and thank you very much for your invitation to the Indian Express. And also let me take this opportunity to wish your young audience, and particularly those who are who are studying and going to take the civil services examination. I wish this has been of some use to them. Really, all the best to you, and thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Outstanding session. Monojit, you would like to say some conclude?
No, I am sorry for myself that I couldn't listen to all that Ambassador Mukul said. I mean, as I apologized in the beginning, we have an edition tonight, and I had to keep going away. But yes, I do feel secure that we have the video of this conversation, and I can get back to it as soon as I can. Immediately afterwards, the video will be up shortly. And for all of you in the audience, the recording will be available on the YouTube channel of the Indian Express, and you can go back to it, share it widely among all your friends, family, contacts. And I was there for the first part of the session. This is an absolute wonderful education. Thank you so much, Ambassador Mukul, again. Thank you, Shubha, for helming this conversation so well, as always. Thank you to our partner, Plutus IAS, and to all of you who tuned in tonight. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.